Don't touch it. Okay. Okay, fingers crossed. Okay, let's give it a try. Hi, everyone. I am Chiara. I am working at the Birkbeck College in UCL, and I've got quite dense session, so I'm gonna get started. So my talk will. Sorry. My talk will. Sorry. There. Okay. Slides are. It's kind of stuck again. I don't know. It's going by himself, and what I see there is not what I see here.
Turn off use timings.
Ah, okay.
Now it should be fine.
Where should I?
And then if you just share it there.
Okay. Should I plug out?
Sorry. Can we play from the laptop again?
Okay. Should be okay. Okay, yeah, I was just saying today I'm going to be talking about data collection and quality control. So it's a quite practical session about application of FNIRs. And after this session, you'll be able to understand how we use FNIRs to record neural activation and what are the pros and cons of this method, to evaluate different practical approaches before setting up a new NIR study, and how to explore the use of some of the packages we use for basic FNIRs data analysis and how to assess FNIRs data quality. So as I just mentioned, this session is very much a link from theory to practice. So with Hamid, he explained very well all the theory, the physics behind FNIRs, the math and behind that. And what I'm trying to do today is bring you from what he talked to do something like practical and super cool like this, which is what we do in my lab. So this is the outline for the next roughly 40 minutes. As I said, it's very dense. So I'm going to rush through it, but if you have questions, please stop me. So we're going to be covering again what FNIRs and why we should use it, a bit about like data collection, the decision that you have to make on before starting a new NIR study, and then basic data analysis tool and data quality control. So let's start with the first session, first part. So just to recap, in practice, what Hamid already talked about. So what if FNIRs? FNIRs is a non-invasive optical technique that we can use to measure the hemodynamic response to neural activation, right? So basically the main component of FNIRs are a set of like a pad with some sources and detectors that are located on the head, on the scalp of the participant. We flashlight from the sources to the detector, and what we are measuring is the light that is absorbed, that's captured into this bit of the cortex here. So what we are measuring are the changes, and as Amit said, in blood oxygenation and deoxygenation, reflected by the near-infrared light. And why we can do that, again, just to recap, is because oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood have slightly different colors. So oxygenated blood is bright red, deoxy is a bit darker. And by measuring, so of course, because of this, they absorb light differently, right? So by measuring how much light is absorbed or scattered, we can say whether the brain region, like the cortex underneath our pad, was activated or not. And just, this is another image to recap that. So we have our sources of light to detector placed on the head. The light goes through the skull, CSF, gray matter, and this is the bit where we're measuring from. And in terms of terminology, where we are measuring from, so the bit of the cortex in between the source and detector is called channel, similarly to the EEG field. So what I'm going to be covering today is mainly continuous wave systems. So Hamid explained different type of system, but today I'm going to be covering mainly CW because this is what mainly you'll be using if you want to do functional studies. And they are basically those systems that have source is continuously on, basically. So you just flashlight continuously on, and you measure changes in oxy and deoxy. They're relatively cheap compared to the other type of system. They're quite easy, robust. They don't need any specific calibration. So even if you don't have like a sophisticated engineer background, but you're just a neuroscientist like me, you can easily use it. They can be expanded to use like several channels, so that's good to cover a big portion of the cortex. They can be expanded to do imaging and DOT. We'll be talking about that later. And the main disadvantage, though, as Hamid already talked about, is that we cannot measure absolute values of oxy and deoxy, but we only measure changes, and I'm going to talk about that later. As we said, oh, sorry, this turns out a bit weird, but basically, in this image, we just said it was just written source here, detector 1, detector 2, and this is the cortex. As I just said before, we flashlight from the source to the detector, and of course, how far the detectors are, it matters to understand how much light, like how deep the light goes into the cortex, right? So the distance between the source and the detectors have an impact on the depth of the measurement. And we can also pair different detectors with one source. For example, in this case here, I have source 5 and 6, that it's paired with detector 8, which is like, as example, this first source detector pair. But I also can do a second measurement where I do like a long distance pair, which in this case will be this pair here. And therefore, like, I measure 2 different bits of the cortex, which is, of course, useful. And this is what we want to do, cover, like, quite a big portion of the cortex. Of course, there is a limitation on how far we can go, because if you put your detector too far from the source, then the light becomes too weak and you cannot measure anything meaningful. So why we should be using FNIRS compared to other neuroimaging methods that have been used so far? So we think that this method has quite a lot of promise. It has a very good temporal resolution, higher than MRI, for example. There's low sensitivity to motion. Having said that, of course, the cap has to be like well tied on the participant's head. And if that's the case, like, of course, there are motion artifacts, but they can be easily identified and correct for that. We can monitor both oxy and deoxy, as Hamid explained already, and I think this is particularly good. Like, as we all know, like, a good and hemodynamic response should see like an increase in oxy and a decrease in deoxy. And that sometimes doesn't always happen in some particular population. For example, sometimes in infants you might see some weird decrease in both oxy and deoxy or increase in both. So having the measurements of both really help you to identify whether you're detecting a real HRF or like a false positive. And it's very easy to combine FNIRS with other modalities. It's often paired with EEG, for example, if you're gonna like get another measurement of the neural activation, or any other technique, for example, eye tracking, EMG, electromyography, BioPAC system to measure physiology. Like, it's very easy to pair FNIRS with other methods. In terms of cons, of course, spatial resolution isn't as great as MRI, of course. We are talking about centimeter. We cannot get the whole head. We cannot get structural images. We have an issue in terms of penetration depth. So, of course, we can only imaging the outer layer of the cortex. So anything that is like substructural cannot be detected by FNIRS. And you get, of course, systemic interferences, because we all know we have like blood like underneath the skull, but there are ways to correct for that. And I just want to spend 1 second to talk about, I think that FNIRS is particularly good to be used with infants and toddlers, because this is what I do in my everyday life, and I can really speak about how good this method is to image the developing brain. So infants and toddlers have a particularly thin scalp and less hair. And of course, this allows the light to efficiently reach the cortex. So you generally get a very good signal, for example, compared to adult. Let's not touch anything. It's quite robust to motion, as I said. So as long as the cap is well tight, the infant is able to move around. If you have a wearable system, they can even just crawl around. So that's great to be done with infants. I think this is actually the most important point. So we can test infants and toddlers while they're awake and free to move. So most of the knowledge on the developing brain so far came from the fMRI field. And of course, you all know that to do fMRI with infants, 99% of the time, I think there's only one study that fMRI with awake infants. Like all the other time, of course, the infants are asleep. And of course, that limits a lot what you can test. Normally, we just either do structural scanning or resting state or auditory stimuli, while the advent of NIRS increased a lot on what we can test, like in terms of like all the social stimulation, visual stimulation. There are a lot of studies doing like interaction, so this is great. And it's quite participants friendly. This is, for example, one of the two systems we have in our lab. So this is the compact FNIR system here. It's quite compact. It stays behind the mom, so the toddler just sits on the mom. And the fact that they're so comfortable staying with their care all the time, to be fair, makes the outcome of the study going very well, because they're very comfortable on that, and they're not stressed out about being separated from the mom. And, or as you see, like on the right, this is another wearable system that we just got in our lab and allowed the toddler to just walk around without really bothering about that. And as I said earlier already, we can measure both oxy and deoxy, which is good to get like a good sense of whether we are getting a real HRF or not false positive. In case you're interested in doing FNIRS in infants and toddlers, I highly recommend you to have a look at this paper. It's a bit dated, but it's still very actual and accurate, and it compares all the methods that are used to do imaging with infants and toddlers, like the pro and cons of every method, and I highlight very well why we think that FNIRS is great in that respect. And recently, like as neuroscience, I think we have to thank engineers to make NIRS even cooler, because recently there have been a lot of development about making FNIRS wearable. So these are some of the systems that are in the commerce right now, especially for adults. Like they're just like a crown, like the Hitachi one, or most of the others are like compact system that the participants can easily wear on a backpack or on the back of the head, like the Ratinis one. And of course, as you can imagine, this increased a lot what we can test with participants. So if you Google up, there are like many studies already that use this type of system to test like to live interaction on the participants walking around. I think there's a study just published where they tested actors on stage live while they were acting with the FNIRS on. So of course, it massively increased the potential of this method and what we can test in terms of the brain. And recently, we've been able to bring that with infants and toddlers too. This is my child that has been, of course, used a lot as a participant in my lab. So at Birkbeck, we just opened the toddler lab, so a lab that has been completely developed to be like at the toddler, to study toddlers. And we've been lucky enough to have this new wearable system where infants and toddlers can literally just walk around. They don't really mind. They're fine with that. They play. They can be themselves literally. And in this slide here, I put also a picture of my son taking part in a sleep study. You might just say, of course, you can do that with fMRI, true. But first of all, the researcher has been able to easily implement EEG2 to account for sleep stages, which is good when you're doing connectivity studies. But also, he was able to sleep on his own buggy, which made him sleep for a solid like 2 hours. And even if he was moving a little bit like that, didn't create much issue in the data. So that was great. And in the toddler lab, as Adam mentioned already, we also are so lucky to have a cave, so an immersive virtual reality. We literally just started to test participants there. So I have a video here that shows you how this 4-year-old girl is playing popping bubbles. So you see it all blurry because she's wearing the 3D glasses with the eye tracking on. So it's like when you go in the 3D cinema, if you don't wear the glasses, you see all blurry. But she sees, with the glasses, she's able to see the depth. So that's super cool. And this is literally the equipment she had on. Again, she tolerated that very well. So the cap with the glasses, with the eye tracking embedded, the little small gray balls that you see are the motion tracker, because we have motion camera to detect where she's moving. And all the NIR system is basically very small, like this big, embedded into the backpack. So this is what we will be able to do over the next few years. So stay tuned for some results about this one. We literally just started. And to be talking again about some potential of FNIRS, definitely outside the conventional setting, I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about the PRIDE project that Adam mentioned at the beginning, so the brain imaging for global health. I was honored to be part of this project for some years. So the idea behind the BRIGHT project was raised by some nutritional studies that were running in the Gambia, where they saw that the infant's head wasn't growing enough compared to WHO standards in the first few years of life in the Gambian infant. So the idea was, okay, if their head is not growing, then what's happening into their brain, right? So my PIs have been able to bring FNIRS and other methods over there to see how brain develops in undernourished infants in the Gambia. And they set up a massive longitudinal study where we had many times point on 200 Gambian infants and 60 UK infants. And now actually we just finished a follow-up of 185 participants at 3 to 5 years of age. And I always like to show these kind of pictures because this is like what we were working with. So, of course, you have to think about something completely different to the setup we're using in our lucky Western countries, where normally we have like, of course, labs that are purposely built for this, for doing neuroimaging research. So that's what we were working on. We were in the MRC unit clinic, and this is the staff that was trained over there. So we've been lucky enough to have one of our PhD students to literally live there for more than a year to properly train the staff, because it's important to know that they know what they're doing while they collect the data, to understand like what is a good data, what is a bad data, what does it mean, and as you all know, like data collection is super important to get something, to get good data, right? And this is another short video that showed the first time that they brought FNIRS over there. So this is the journey that my PIs did to bring the FNIRS system over there, quite turbulent. And this is the MRC unit where the whole study is based, and this is like the nerve system packed on this car. And this was the very, very first participants they tested over there. After a few hours, the FNIRS system was up and running. And these are my two PIs, Prof. Chiara and Dr. Sarah Lloyd-Fox. And after a few hours that the system was there, they literally been able to put the cap on and testing the very first participants of the BRIGHT project. And I think this speaks a lot about the versatility of this method and how it opened up the doors to do research in avenues that it wasn't really possible before. And this is the paper, again, that speaks about this, if you want to have a look at that. So again, just to show off a little bit like how cool FNIRS is in terms of like the system arrived, and only after like 3 hours they've been able to test the first participants and recover the first hemodynamic responses in the regions where they were supposed to be. So that was cool. And if you're interested to do FNIRS in this type of setting, again, this is another paper that I highly recommend because it touched on all the challenges that we found in the Gambia and how we try to solve that. Because when you're doing research, neuroimaging research outside your comfortable setting, there are so many aspects that you don't think about, and then when you are on the field, you realize that they will impact your research and your data. For example, just mentioning a few, the maintenance of the system. So the system has been heavily used, like over there, they test once or twice a day, every day, 24/7. So it's like heavily used, and sometimes these systems are not built to be used that much. So that's something that it has to be taken into account. There's a lot of dust, there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of humidity. So we had to be in touch with the system providers a lot to being able to understand how to care for the system a bit more than what we would normally do. You have to take into account transportation, as I showed you in the video earlier. It's not only about the first time that you bring the system there, but it's also like every single time that something gets broken and you have to send like a replacement there, it takes like forever because it's not like well connected as, for example, London is. You have to take into account like the climate. So there are periods of like torrential rains, and then periods of very, very dry season. So again, the system needs extra protection. The participants sweat a lot, and then again, something that we haven't taken into account earlier, but then we realized that the band was slipping. So then we had to being able to install aircon in all the labs. As I mentioned earlier, the head size doesn't increase as much, and again, that's something that we haven't planned earlier. So in our UK cohort, we are increasing the cap as long as the participants age, and that's something that we realize it's not needed over there, but again, you have to take that into account. You have to take into account that they have dark skin and hair in this population, so of course that increase in light attenuation and braided hair. And as you see here, you can easily see where the optodes was placed on one of those knots and where actually the channels were perfectly fine. So again, we had to hire an hairdresser to undo all the knots, or we have to make like a decision to put like the optodes in between the knots in order to be able to get sensible data. And of course, all the stimuli, everything that you think about has to be culturally adapted because most of them have never seen, for example, a white woman. So everything needs to be adapted for them in order to be well accepted. Okay, so this was the very first part. If it's all good with you guys, I'm going to go through this next section, which will be about data collection, if the computer helped me. Yeah, it's fine, as you wish. Do you mind up there putting my presentation up, maybe, because this... Sorry about that. But then, Adam, do I have to do something here or no? Ah, okay. And
So here, yeah, you're good to go. You just use this.
oops, okay. Sorry about that. So let's go through data collection. So this is very practical and technical about all you have to think about when you start a new study if you're a new FNIRS user. So FNIRS system use optical fibers. So most of the system use something that is very similar to this. So they are quite flexible and robust, but some of them are made of glass, so you have to treat them carefully. Most of the source fibers are bifurcated at the end because we get two wavelengths in most of the system, while the detector fiber is just like a straight fiber, like this one. And they are like 90-degree bends at the end, at the subject end, to lie on the participant's skull. And so this will be provided by the system, these type of fibers, so it's not something that you have to worry about. One thing that you have to decide on is whether you want to use like the infant fibers or the adult fibers. So of course, if you're testing infants, you don't want to scratch their head. Most of them don't have much hair. Their scalp and skull is very thin, so you can just use the flat fibers like the one on top. But if you're testing adults, of course, we highly recommend you to use something like that with a pointy end, and that will allow you, similarly to EEG, to effectively go through the hair, or you can use like the spring-loaded, which is one that can be pushed, goes up and down. And once you decided on these fibers that you're using, then you can pair them with several different type of cap or band. So the first silicone band that you see, it's something that has been custom developed in my lab when they first started to test infants, and there were no caps available for that size yet. So they literally made their own like silicone band, and we used that. I think nowadays EasyCap provide caps for all sizes, so most of the NIRS lab use that with every ages, do something like this. Again, it's something very similar to the EEG, and you can easily put, like with different type of optodosers, you can plug the fibers into the cap. But again, this will be provided by the system that you use. So once you've got your fibers, once you've got your hat, you have to think about, okay, where I'm going to put these fibers, right? So as we said, unfortunately, with FNIRS, we cannot cover the whole head. It's very much like hypothesis-driven. So if you know you're testing, like, for example, a specific cognitive domain or a social domain, you know, reviewing literature to which brain regions you think will be activated, and you focus the position of your optodes on that specific brain region, right? So what you want to do is, of course, maximize the coverage, maximize the channel density, maximize the channel overlap, maybe including a range of different separation. But of course, also maximize stability and minimize the motion. So especially if you're talking about infants and toddlers, you can imagine that you don't want to put like a super heavy cap on them because otherwise their head will be bent. So you have to think about all of this, given some limitation we have. Like, of course, we don't have a limited numbers of fibers. There's a minimum and a max of source detector separation. It's very important to think about the wave, the comfort of the subject, again, because you want the participants to be quite comfortable, right, with a hat on. So for example, if you have like, just to give you an idea of how differently you can pair things, like if you have a set of 8 sources and 8 detectors that you want to cover a specific region, then you can do something like this, where you have like a 3 centimeter source detector separation, 24 channel in total. We covered a quite large area, but we use like only one single source detector separation, and the sensitivity that we cover is quite patchy though. Or you can do, using the same set of sources and detectors, something like this. And we actually increase the number of channels by 6 channels, which is not little. So we have 30 channels in total. We cover a reasonable area, and we have different ranges of those detector separation and a more uniform sensitivity. So this is something that you have to think about. Some of the system provider will support you on that, especially if you're first-year users. Some don't. So it's something that the researcher has to think about before starting the study. And again, it's something that we highly recommend you before you start, is checking where your optodes are on the head to make sure you're measuring exactly what you want to measure from, right? So there are tools that helps you to log your optodes on the MNI template. One, for example, if Atlas Viewer, you can do that in Nearest SPM. Of course, again, if you're testing infants and toddlers, as I'm doing, you have to make sure that there is an MNI of the age that you're interested in. Of course, you don't want to plot your optodes on an adult MNI if you're testing infants, and that's not always available, so you might need to do a little bit more of like computing yourself. But yeah, that's just an example of Atlas Viewer, for example, where you plug in all the optodes location and you check on the head where that's on the cortex. You can use like a photogrammetry method that's used a lot, I realized, in architecture now, where you take like loads of pictures of a video of the participants with hat on. Again, we advise on do this before starting the study, but also every time you test the participants to make sure that your optodes are located exactly where you want. So you take all these pictures or a movie, and then there are some tools, like this is the one that we use in our lab, StoreNet, but I think there are many you can use. They will basically, you upload all these pictures and video, and they will basically create the 3D map of your optodes on the head for you. Or like a bit old style, this is what we used to do in our lab until very recently. We literally measure like the optodes location or the compared to a reference on the participant's head, and then we used to, again, do some computing to import all these location and create to log the optodes on the baby's head. Or you can do what's called like a digitizer. This is like a polymus. Again, this kind of creates a magnetic field around the head of the participant, and by touching the reference point and the optodes location on the participant's head with this pen, you get, again, a 3D model of the participants, and you plot these data on the MNI. I don't particularly advise on using this one on infants, because if it's true that even if he has a reference that corrects for motion, children just move too much, so it doesn't, I don't know, from my experience, it didn't work very, very well. And yeah, this is just like an example of headgear from very different studies, so be creative, depending on what you're looking at, which brain regions you're interested in. So just to finish up this section, a little bit about study design. I think this overlaps quite nicely with fMRI, so most of you might be familiar already with that. So once we've got our headgear ready to start with, then we have to set up our study, right? What we want to, depending on what we want to test. So FNIR studies are basically about extracting the HRF, right, from a given functional stimulus. So the characteristic, of course, of the HRF and the characteristic of FNIR's measurement are those that dictate which experimental approach are appropriate and those that are not. So as you all know, this is the HRF. Its features are that it's very slow, so it starts 1-3 seconds post-stimulus onset, and it can last up to 3 to 10 seconds post-stimulus offset. Again, if you're interested in infants and toddlers, bear in mind that that's even slower. So you have to take that into account when you design your stimuli. It's localized to the brain regions you think they are related to the stimuli. And it's quite small, that's very important. So the signal-to-noise ratio is very, very low. And so that makes the HRF quite smaller than the normal physiological oscillation. So because the signal-to-noise ratio is very low, we have to extract the HRF from all the background noise and changes, and therefore we have to perform multiple repetition, right? You know that from MRI, of a single stimuli, and then do some averaging of all the same stimulus of the same conditions. And because the response is low, we cannot apply stimuli in very rapidly in arbitrary succession, because otherwise the HRF will overlap in time. And because it's localized, of course, where the HRF occurs, it's important for the study, and for that we already work on designing an effective headgear. So as Hamid already described, with the sub-CW nears, we can only measure changes in concentration. That means that normally with F nears, we compare two states, so either condition A with condition B, or like a specific condition compared to rest and active. So this is basically all the things that we're getting when we are acquiring an F-near signal. So we have like vasomotor waves, respiration, cardiac pulsation. We have the functional signal, which is what we care. We have measurement noise and motion artifacts. So what we want to do is to isolate the functional signal, right? And there are ways that, so many of these confounds that can be eliminated later on with filtering and processing, but there are also some things that you might want to take into account when you set up your studies, because some of these can be some of these confounds can be avoided if you design your study properly. For example, respiration, vasomotor waves, and measurement noise can be avoided with a good design, and the rest will be taken out with filtering. And the reason why, well, and so talking about stimulus presentation, so how can I avoid, for example, respiration to affect, affect and be on top of my HRF? You have to think about stimulus presentation. So as you all know, again, from fMRI, stimulus can be like a block design or event related. I would say with nears, especially with infants, fast event-related design are very rare, because again, otherwise the HRS will be like all overlap to each other, and it's very difficult to isolate where the HRF is coming from. And as we said, multiple repetition are important to increase the statistical power of your response. And it's something that we highly recommend normally is doing jittering to reduce the synchronization of your background physiology, for example, respiration, to avoid false positives. So jittering just means instead of having always the same constant duration of baseline and condition, just to do like a slightly variation, for example, 6 to 8 seconds, 6 to 9 seconds. Because in these cases, you see like respiration is right on sync with the stimulus, and of course with your HRF, so that will be a bit harder than to filter it out. While if you do like jittering, as you see in this case, it's not always the same, then respiration won't be right synchronized with the presentation of the stimuli, and therefore it won't be synchronized with your HRF. And yeah, so this is basically an example where we did that. This is a task that we use in the Gambia, where we alternated social and non-social stimuli, and as you saw, like they were jitter, the stimuli and the baseline were jitter 9 to 12 seconds, and we got very good data out of that. Okay, so we're almost there. Last part, basic data analysis and quality control, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some toolbox that you can use to look at the nears data. Okay, we designed the headgear, we got the stimulus design, we collected some data, now we want to look at the data, right? So of course, the idea behind processing some nears data is just to start from the raw intensity and extract the HRF, right? This is what we want to get at the end. And this can be done in a variety of ways using several different processes. A lot of people still use their own script in MATLAB or Python. And of course, the appropriate process stream will depend on the experimental design, so we're not going to talk too much about that because it's very depending on what you're collecting. So here I'm going to go through some of the most used available processing packages. So the first one that I'm going to talk is Homer. It's MATLAB based, it's freely available. So the pro of this program, I think, is definitely that you have extensive pre-processing options, so a lot to do about like several different options for motion artifacts, filtering, and yeah, you can look at all the time courses at every step of the pre-processing. Unfortunately, you cannot do any statistical analysis. So a lot of people use Homer to do the pre-processing, and then they extract the data, and then they move on to MATLAB or any statistical software to do that analysis. The good thing is that it's very, very used in the field. So the forum, the community is very active. So if you have an issue, you post it up there. I'm sure that like the day after you will have an answer that try to help you to solve the issue, or someone else will have had the same issue. So good for all the pre-processing, not great for stats. A very similar tool is NIRS Toolbox Analyzer that actually was born from someone that developed the first Homer version. So it's the GUI itself, it's also very similar. It started from Homer, but it's more focused on the data analysis. So it's actually the opposite of Homer. So not very good for pre-processing, but great for more like advanced data analysis. And you can even just generate synthetic data, do a little bit of imaging reconstruction and things like that. NIRS SPM, so for those of you who use SPM for fMRI, you will like that. It's very, like also the GUI, it's very, very similar. And the idea behind is literally like importing the NIRS data and kind of treating them as they are like fMRI similar. So it has been adapted from fMRI. Again, it's MATLAB based. All these programs that we've been talking about, you can either use the GUI or use the function in MATLAB yourself as you wish. As you know, NIRS SPM can produce, very similarly to fMRI, you produce statistical map of brain activation overlaid on a brain template. Again, make sure there is the brain template of the age you're interested in. And you can do a bit more like advanced modeling, like using the GLM. You can do connectivity analysis. But it's not as great for pre-processing options. So again, a lot of people I know use, for example, Homer for pre-processing, and then you just need to convert your data and import them in SVM to do a bit more of like advanced modeling. So just a little bit more on Homer, because this is like the one that is, I guess, mostly used. And if you are a new NIRS user, you might want to start looking at your data with that. As I said, it's MATLAB script design, and it's freely available and well documented. And this is like how the GUI look like, just to give you like a brief overview. Of course, if you want to use that, there are, I think, quite a lot of tutorials online on YouTube, or there are also courses running yearly. So this is the channel layout, and the channels are color-coded. So, for example, the pink channel is the one displayed over there. Then there's the purple one, and you can click on the channel and visualize your channel over there. The straight line are the stimulus markers, so those are your different conditions. And if you have different conditions, they're also color-coded too. On the left-hand side there, you see all your subjects. So in this case, we only have one subject, but you will see all of them up there. You have different wavelets. And this is, again, if you click on Tools and Steam GUI, you see all the different conditions, and you can exclude or include the condition based on, for example, a looking time, or for whichever reason you want to exclude or include a condition. And this is like all the different options that you have to process your data. So as I said, there's an extensive list of functions that you can use. If you click on that, you see the actual MATLAB code running. So you can see the actual MATLAB code, so you can see actually what the function does. And this is the, like, once you selected your function, this is the tool that allow you to select all the different thresholds if you want to use that function. Okay, so this was just a little bit about like analysis tool. Then I'm going to spend the very last few minutes to talk about a new tool that Luca Polonini has been developing recently to assess fNIRS data quality, and I've been helping him to adapt his tool to NIRS, to infant data. And the reason why I started to collaborate with him is because I was analyzing data out of my pride project, and what I was seeing was this. So this was like data at the very final stage. So this should be like an HRF. Every line is a baby. But as you see, even if you've never seen a NIRS data, I wasn't really happy about that. So the channels were pruned, so eliminated at the beginning, just with a very, very basic function in Homer. But as you see, there was still like a lot of variability between infants. There were still like loads of low quality channels surviving this cleaning. And therefore, the only thing that was left to be done was to literally go back and manually visually inspect every channel and delete the channels that I wasn't happy about. So there was still like loads of channel, very noisy, that was clearly not anything like functionally related that I didn't want in my data. And this was like across different projects. So it was like from the BRIGHT project, but also from the BEAM project, which is collecting NIRS data in Bangladesh, so very similar to the BRIGHT one, and across different ages. So it wasn't something specifically related to a sample. So what I did, I started to look a bit more into these bad channels. And if I did like the power spectrum of these channels, I realized that a common feature of these bad channels was that they didn't have any cardiac pulsation in it. So the channel 31 that you see there was like a good channel. As you see, you can clearly see the peak that in that case was around 2 Hertz. Because in infants' heartbeat, it's a little bit like a higher frequency. And the very bad channel in dark red that you see there is channel 25, so completely flat. And that's when I started to collaborate with Luca Polonini from University of Houston about that, because he was developing a tool to assess data quality based on cardiac pulsation present in the data. And the idea behind that is that, so we all know that the pulsations that are coming from the skin are mainly driven by cardiac activity, while the pulsations that are coming from the cortex are driven by cardiac activity and neuronal activity, right? The thing is that the cardiac activity is way bigger than the neuronal activity. So if an optode loses contact over the skin, then the neuronal activity will decrease, but also the cardiac activity will decrease. So we're kind of using the cardiac activity as an indicator of the neuronal activity, and basically if you're getting a meaningful near signal like from the cerebral cortex or not. And very briefly to go through his tool, but you can find more info online or if you Google up his paper. So Luca came up with these 2 measures, both in the temporal domain, so the scalp coupling index is in the temporal domain and the peak power spectrum in the spectral domain, to identify whether there is cardiac pulsation in the near signal. So basically, if you have your signal raw data from both wavelengths, you can see in that case it's a good signal, you see the cardiac pulsation. If you bandpass filter the signal where you think that the cardiac pulsation happens, and then you normalize and you cross-correlate the 2 signal, you get a function like this, and that's what we call like scalp coupling index. And of course the user needs to define a threshold to understand what's good and bad. And then if you do like a Fourier transformation of the signal, you calculate the power spectrum, and you can easily see again what I was doing in my raw data to see whether there is the heartbeat signal in the data. So the combination of these 2 will allow us to identify whether we are in front of a good or a bad channel, basically. So the thing is that the quality of the signal is time variant, so we cannot only use, for example, the first few seconds or average out the whole recording to understand whether we are working with a good or a bad channel. So Luca came up with this idea of calculating window of 3 to 5 seconds of the whole recording and redoing this calculation of SEI and PCS for every single window, so to understand which bits of the channel are good or bad. So again, this is an example of a very good signal where we have both high SEI and PSP, poor optical coupling where we have both bad, or movement artifact. This is where it's good to have both signal because, for example, movement artifacts it's tricky because it will give us still a very good SEI because the 2 wavelengths will be highly correlated because, of course, movement impacts both wavelengths. But movements just completely mess up the power spectrum. So there we will see that the power spectrum isn't great. And this is the thing where I was talking about channels by window. So you have 3 maps in his tool. So this is like a GUI that you can easily download. I have the link later on. His tool is called QT-NIRS, so quality NIRS. So you have channels by windows, and the tool does this calculation of SEI, PSP by window. So you can easily see like a channel that is bad throughout the whole recording. You have the binary calculation on the left. And while when motion happen, you have like this vertical line where, of course, something is bad throughout the whole channels. And the idea is to use this tool to then define, okay, the user has to define a threshold, okay, the minimum proportion of bad data that I allow per each channel into my recording. So then I use this one to prune the channel and then to go on into statistical analysis. So again, I highly recommend you to have a look at this tool. You can freely download it and use it. It's actually more than happy if a lot of people are using it to test it in your own data. It's good because this tool is like not dependent on any system or any, like I've tested it on infants, we're testing it on infants, on any system or any wavelength, so it's very like highly generalizable and universal, and other people are working to incorporate this tool on all the different toolbox I've talked to you about earlier. And so when I was going back to my data and using Luca's tool, I was very happy to see that then what came out was this one, which are way nicer, like HRF. And of course, you see there's way less variability in the data, very few low channels survive this cleaning, and there's no need for visual inspection and a more like standardized way to look at the data, which is what, as a community, we're working on. So I finished. So I hope that after this session you've learned that we can use FNIRS. FNIRS uses sources and detector of near-infrared light to infer brain activation. I hope I showed you several pros of this method, including its easy use with awake infants, possible wearability, and the implementation in non-conventional settings. Before setting up a new NIR study, researchers have to decide on the array design, study design, to efficiently recover the HRF in brain regions of interest. And in the last session, we saw that OMER is a tool very suitable for data visualization and basic data analysis. And then I showed you about QT-NIRs that allow us to assess FNIRS data quality and select valid channel for later data analysis based on the cardiac pulsation in the data. Thank you so much for your attention.